I'd like to welcome you all to this quite specific webinar on subsidiary governance, pitfalls and myth-busting. And it may seem that while the world is very sadly burning around us, that this is quite an arcane subject to be focusing on, but it's also very apposite given the state of the world now and some of the measures that are being taken around sanctions, etc., for example, actually has a sort of a pressing relevance for our topic today. But I'd like to sort of perhaps just give you a little bit of context and then introduce our speakers. And I should say we're recording this webinar, and I would very much welcome your questions as we go along. So please do use the Q&A function as we continue. Next chart, please, Amy. Just to set a little bit of context, it became increasingly clear to us at Fidelio that subsidiary governance was gaining in importance as we, across all the assignments that we were working on, could see more and more subsidiary boards coming into focus. For example, board evaluations were being conducted at subsidiary board level. If we look at the search practice, actually sort of a lot of thought being given to composition at subsidiary board level. And again, sort of, when conducting that search process, evidencing the independence and the integrity of the search process. And also on development, that we were actually conducting quite a lot of development work for subsidiary board directors and not just main board directors. So clearly there was, something afoot with regard to subsidiary board governance. Next chart, please, Amy. And today we're delighted to be joined by Sam Timms, who's Managing Director at Promontory and also has a career as a senior regulator in her past as well, and who will help us pick through some of the challenges, some of the myths regarding subsidiary governance, particularly from a financial services perspective, but we will also open up to a broader discussion. I'm also joined by two of my colleagues, Steve Cheetham and Alistair Strannock, and who will also be helping us perhaps think through from more of a strategy and an investor perspective as well. Next chart, please. But before we open up to the broader discussion, I'd like to ask you, our audience, obviously you have an interest in subsidiary board governance and what makes an effective subsidiary board. And so if there's just one key ingredient, one secret sauce to an effective subsidiary board, what would you consider that to be? A, the clarity of the terms of reference. Everybody knows exactly what they're doing at which level of the organisation. B, the behaviours, the board behaviour at group and subsidiary level. Or C, the compelling and well-structured nature of the strategy, that the organisation knows where it's going and there's a huge clarity at both board and subsidiary level. So terms of reference, board behaviour or strategy. So if I could ask, we can't vote, I should say to the panelists, but if I could ask everybody else to complete the poll, and if Amy can perhaps let me know when we get the results in. There we go. Interesting. So the really the strongest ingredient, the secret sauce, is very much for board behaviour. So more than structures, more than the compelling sense of direction. And this is something perhaps that Sam will be able to pick up on. And I'm quite pleased to see that, because I think from a personal perspective, while structures and clarity of remit are very important, those board behaviours are absolutely critical. So thank you for that. And now let's move on to the meat, to continue this metaphor, the meat of today's discussion. There are three topics that we're going to work through. Firstly, a little bit of history to give context, because I think that's helpful to understand why subsidiaries have become so important and why the focus. The second area, where Sam is also going to explore with us, is what are some of the pitfalls and what are some of the myths at subsidiary level? And then thirdly, I'll open it up to look beyond financial services at other sectors, and to think through some of those sort of commonalities that we're seeing across subsidiary board. And then we'll open up to Q&A. So Sam, first of all, welcome. We're delighted that you're here and joining us today. And I'd like to kick off maybe with the first question, Amy. We can flip through to the next slide. Where are we today? Perhaps you can just give us some context regarding the importance of subsidiaries and why we've got this focus that we have today.
Sure, and thank you very much for asking me to join you on what I think is an incredibly interesting discussion, and one that is developing. So thank you for that. I mean, I think a sort of statement of the obvious, really, subsidiaries is a well-rehearsed, well-known construct for all sorts of very good reasons. Having subsidiaries within a broader group can manage geographies, it can manage acquisitions, it can manage different businesses, etc. So I think that is well known. I think, like you, what we've seen is a growing evolution of the concept and the commitment to subsidiary governance, and the possibility and then the implementation of, let's call them proper boards, fully fledged boards sitting within the subsidiaries. As you rightly point out, my background is financial services, and so that colours, I think, much of what I've seen, though, as we'll talk about later, that can often flow into what other sectors do. From a regulator's perspective, regulators tend to like subsidiaries, and so we have seen that a great deal in financial services. And there are two sort of reasons that they like them. One is a sort of business as usual reason, and the other is around the global financial crisis. In a business as usual context, really most regulation, not all these days, but originally much regulation, recognised an individual entity and gave a permission, a legal permission under the regime to a particular entity, be it an insurer, a bank, etc. It didn't really recognise the concept in the same way of a parent, and it particularly struggled with giving a permission or approval to act to a holding company that was not trading, other than that was merely a holding company. So, and a lot of financial services groups have a holding company often listed, sitting at the top level, but the actual trading business is sitting in subsidiaries. The second reason is it allowed them to regulate the right bits of the group, and to apply the right regulations to the different bits of the group. So if you had a group that was both insurer and bank, different regimes applying to both of them. For example, certain groups, so major commodities houses, for example, you have a small trading subsidiary that is in financial services, but actually the rest of the group is doing something quite different. So a commodities house, maybe one of the big oil companies, etc., might have a derivatives trading arm, but that's not the main business, and the regulators themselves don't want to and have no competence to regulate oil drilling. Another example would be the car manufacturing companies with finance companies associated with them. Again, the regulators don't want to and wouldn't be able to regulate the car manufacturing bit, but do care deeply about the finance bit. The other reason they like is because it allows them to regulate locally, and the global financial crisis is relevant there, because we saw a bit more of a move where the regulators were not entirely happy, the financial services regulators, that an overseas regulator was equivalent and applied the same standard of regulation to an entity. It would be less keen on branches in the UK and would look more for a subsidiary that it couldn't get its hands around, and where there would be less likelihood of a sort of fungible treatment of capital and liquidity, so money flowing out of the entity, which the UK regulators or the local regulators, because this is not unique to the UK, could get their hands on. And a good example there would be things like Barings sending lots of money to Singapore in the old days, or indeed Lehman's, etc. So you saw that come to life a bit more during the financial crisis. It also allows them to think about, again, post-global financial crisis, the concept of recovery and resolution. So this idea that if a financial services house has a particular challenge, it can be recovered and separate from its parent and the other parts of the group, or if not, it could be resolved, that is wound down safely, again, separate from other parts of the group. So all of those have been a bit at play, but all of those require a proper board and proper governance and decision making to take place at the entity. And so that's, I think, one of the areas where you've seen a growing interest amongst financial services regulators in entity boards. That's quite a lot of information, so let me pause there for you, Gillian, and ask if that's touching on the areas that are of interest to this group.
I think that does very much, and it sort of sets the scene as to why regulators are so interested in subsidiary boards, sort of something that they can get their arms around, and also bringing that sort of governance and decision making very close to the entity. There's an accountability, and I know that's a theme that we'll talk about there. And in some ways, that's I think for those of us who lived through the financial crisis, we absolutely see why this is important, and it, you know, described in those terms seems evident as well. And yet, within many groups, subsidiary governance can be challenging. I think lines of accountability, but also the sense of, well, where do things take place? Where does the decision making take place? Who establishes the sense of direction, particularly when the regulators might have one view and the board in San Francisco might have a different view, for example. So I wonder if we could move perhaps to our next question and just take some of these topics really head on. Let's go through what are some of the myths and the pitfalls around subsidiary governance. And I know if we look at it through the regulatory prism, some themes immediately come to mind around independence and strategic direction. So Sam, if I could hand over to you, your thoughts on, you know, busting some of these myths perhaps about subsidiary governance.
Thank you. And I guess there are 3 or 4. The first, absolutely go to where you've gone to, Gillian, which is the question of what is independence and how independent is a group or a subsidiary really, and how does that independence manifest. I've had discussions with regulators, and they're, you know, it's never black and white. The regulators tend to be very focused on independence, I think rightly so, and independence of decision making, etc. But even then, there can be some challenges around that. So a good example, I had a discussion with the regulators a little while ago around how independent a subsidiary board, a major board, was. And their starting point was, well, it should be fully independent. But then when we started to explore what that really means and started saying things like, okay, so are we happy for it to be able to change its accountants? At which point you immediately skid to a halt and think, well, the idea of having different sets of accountants and different accountant appointment processes for subsidiaries, including with all the rules that go with your accountants needing to be independent, suddenly becomes really very difficult and very complicated, and in fact not the right answer at all. So I think we all agreed that would be a very good measure of, you know, that's a level of independence that has gone too far. But immediately you are into, well, then we're relying on our accountants, for example, who will have been appointed through a process run by the group. We may or may not have had a seat at that table. They're managing policies and practices around, for example, maintaining independence of the accountants, when we can use them for other activities, etc. So suddenly you are also into the idea that you have group policies. And actually, of course, you have group policies. You'll have group resourcing policies where the major groups will move people around the group and grow them through some of their smaller businesses, etc. So again, thinking about independence and dependence on other parts of the group in terms of access to resource, whether that's human resource, whether that's technology resource, etc. And again, the regulators have faced into this possibility. And one of the things that you often now have discussions with them on is the concept of outsourcing, including the concept of internal outsourcing. So where you as a subsidiary and your subsidiary board might be relying on the group provision of a service such as technology, or the internal audit function, how do you oversee that the group is actually doing that correctly? Or if you're an insurer, you've got a group asset manager, how do you ensure that that service is being delivered in a way that is tantamount to arm's length, with all of the appropriate SLAs, service standards, disciplines around reappointment, around pricing, etc., etc. All of that then takes you to questions around independence, but one of the big debates everyone has is, so what does an independent non-executive mean? And the regulators often start with, they don't end there, but they start with, well, we have a framework around FRC and governance and listed companies, etc. Why don't we start with our thought process there? But what do you do with a listed group, or indeed a huge group that is not listed, that has boards sitting below it and may or may not want to have independent non-executives sitting in those boards? So that might be non-executives at the board level who are from entirely out with the group, or indeed it might be, which is not an uncommon construct, an independent non-executive at the group level dropping down into the subsidiary and perhaps chairing the subsidiary or chairing one of its committees, etc. Committee is another thorny area for independence. Do you have the full suite of committees at each of the subsidiaries? Suddenly you've got 9 audit committees. How do they interact? Or do you have your subsidiary relying on a group audit committee? And if so, how do you interact with the group audit committee? So that concept of how independent is independent, I think, has lots and lots of ramifications, very multidimensional, very needs to be specific to the particular group and the way that the group operates, and is in part a function as well of the level of activity of the subsidiary. Which ones are regulated, perhaps, which ones are not, which ones are very active, which ones are running balance sheet risk, etc. So for me, that's, I think, probably the starting place for what's one of the both pitfalls, but also something that needs an enormous amount of consideration, because it can be a real strength for a group. Let me pause there before I plough on and do some other pitfalls and myths, as it were.
Thank you. No, I think we certainly see independence as being a major theme. I mean, I guess one of the perhaps advantages and upsides is for those interested in pursuing an independent career, a whole new group of boards have become available, which are actually extremely interesting. Yes. And very visible, and do require strong independent directors. But perhaps one of the themes we might come back to is the sort of the judgment also that's required on the part of individual directors as they think through. We've I guess talked about it a little bit from the regulatory perspective, but also from the individual board director's perspective, how to exercise that judgment. And we are beginning to get comments coming in on that theme. Why don't we work through some of the other pitfalls and myths, and then we can come back to the questions that are coming in and the observations. Please do keep the chat going as we continue. So over to you, Sam.
Thank you. So maybe just a couple of others. The first is, whenever I talk to subsidiary boards, the question of strategy always comes up. How much do we are we the masters of our own strategy? How much do we have around strategy? And a lot of organizations start from the presumption, well, the strategies are given, the group decides the strategy and it cascades it down through the entity. And I'm not entirely persuaded by that, because I think even where the entire group is operating in a single area, so it's a banking group with lots of subsidiary banks, for example, or an insurance group, etc., even then I think there will be ways that the subsidiary can influence the group's consideration of strategy. And I think there are ways that the entity should give consideration to how it wants to then implement and measure the success of that strategy within its particular area, which might be its particular geography or its particular sector, etc. And I think those two absolutely go hand in hand. I think there's also a sort of capital S strategy. What are we here for? What are we trying to deliver? What's our customer base, etc. And then there's a small S strategy, which is, what is our strategy for? In the past, it might be for managing Brexit. What is our strategy for managing cyber, for managing investment in technology, etc. So I think there's a lot that an entity can own around the capital S strategy, contributing to group consideration, and then thinking about how to implement and manage, and possibly be a bit less than the group strategy. It should never be more than the group strategy. I think an entity can't go off on a sort of frolic of its own, but how it then takes that strategy and makes that strategy live for the entity. And then the other is, what is the sort of narrower strategy for managing certain aspects of the business? One of the things I always counsel regulated businesses to do is to think about what is your strategy for working with your regulators and for informing the way they describe you. Again, let me pause.
Thank you. And I can see sort of themes. I mean, we often think about the sort of the envelope for strategy, and I like this sort of the the definition that you gave, but also that fear that the subsidiary might go off on a frolic, and yes. I mean, it sounds comical, but it clearly is quite a fear, and it is. There's an element also of trust, isn't there, and really building that sort of trusting relationship between group and subsidiary as well.
Maybe if I could just add one thought there, actually, which is quite often, and without turning this into a cottage industry, I do have discussions with subsidiaries about, and what subsidiaries have you got? And how do you oversee them? Because in part that brings to life the construct of this chain down through the group. And quite often they have got subsidiaries. It might be a book of business they bought, which is slightly separately incorporated and doesn't necessarily have a fully fledged board, etc. So exactly where you go, I think thinking about that, the frolic of its own, and making sure that you're properly overseeing your subsidiaries is another thing to think about.
Thank you. And Sam, let's just sort of wrap up this pitfalls and myths section, and then I can see we've got questions coming in. So would you like to just wrap up that section?
Yes, the last for me, which I would add into this discussion, is our subsidiaries interesting. And I've heard both, positions. I've heard people say, well, I'd only ever want to sit on the group, because I think that must be the most interesting construct. And I've heard people say, actually, I really would rather sit on the subsidiary because those are the major operating entities, and I find being a little bit close to the coalface much more interesting. My instinct is, and of course it will be very group dependent, my instinct is either and both can be enormously interesting. I think the place at which it becomes difficult, but difficult in a really interesting way, is if you sit on both. So if you are flowed down through from the group and then down into the subsidiary.
Thank you. Yes, I mean, having sort of worked at group and sat on subsidiary boards, both are fascinating. I think one of the themes I would say that comes through is one, the judgment, the ability to understand where you are within the organisation. Two, probably a realistic understanding of the remit and the limitations, including the grey areas, and particularly if you're on the subsidiary board, an ability to influence, I think is really important.
Absolutely.
Yeah, thank you. And Amy, let's flip to the next chart. And this is really just looking at the, how this extends beyond financial services. All the reasons that Sam gave in the beginning apply to multinational groups globally, and the subsidiary is not a sort of the domain just of financial services. Clearly, it's a legal construct that we're all familiar with. I think what we've seen is that first of all, it's been the sort of the captive insurers, the captive financial services providers that have probably attracted the same level of sort of regulatory scrutiny, which has probably upped the standard in some ways and the focus on the governance of those boards. And I think it's that regulatory theme that we are seeing this sort of moving across, that we've talked before, and I know there's almost a commonality about sitting on a regulated board, being able to engage with regulators, having a sort of the mindset that can operate within a highly regulated framework. And I think we're seeing that almost in subsidiary governance as well. And one of the sort of quite interesting dynamics perhaps to think about is, sometimes the subsidiary board offers a lever to the regulator. And I think perhaps, if you look at Uber in the UK and the value of that license for London and TfL as a regulator, you can sort of see, really sort of a very clear spotlight on the importance of subsidiary governance, sometimes way beyond its own jurisdiction. So I think that's, we're absolutely seeing that these themes and the importance of subsidiary boards extends well beyond the financial services sector. And I think probably just where we are today, many companies will be looking at their own structures and looking both in terms of counterparty risk, but also structures and are there boards within the group? Are there companies within the group? Are there directors within the group who may bring exposure, for example, to Russia? And this is something that we might want to come back to. And one of the things just I'd like to pick up on is, I think those who succeed, and we've been asked, this is one of the questions, those who succeed at subsidiary board level typically do have an ability to influence. I think it's a very interesting career move, and it can have a real visibility. And I would say for the chair in particular, I've been very impressed by chairs of subsidiary boards. They're very high levels of stakeholder engagement skills. I almost think it might even be greater than for the chair of the group board, because there's a sort of a clarity and authority, but very often the chair of a European subsidiary, for example, is working across lines of business lines, legal entities, and really requires strong influencing skills and extraordinary stakeholder engagement skills. But I'd now like to just open up to sort of questions, and I can see questions coming in. I'm going to start with Steve. You had a question for Sam, really from the investor perspective. So if I could hand over to you, Steve.
Yes, thank you, Gillian, and thank you, Sam, for your remarks so far. What was concerning me, or rather what I'd be interested to hear you talk about, is best practice in communicating with investors around, I guess, the comfort. I mean, you mentioned about subsidiaries going off on a frolic. That's really pretty much an investor's worst nightmare. So I think investors hate bad news. They hate blow-ups. They hate subsidiaries that kind of go off on frolics and it ends badly. So how would you see best practice in giving investors comfort that the subsidiary process and subsidiary governance is well managed?
I think that's a really good, by which I really mean very difficult question, but I think it is a really good question. And I think there are lots of mechanisms. I mean, when I look at the groups that I know, I think 2 or 3 things come to mind. The first is being very clear which are your key subsidiaries, your material subsidiaries, though we also know that, at least reputationally, quite apparently immaterial subsidiaries in terms of numbers, balance sheet, contribution to P&L, etc., can cause a lot of damage reputationally. But I think being clear about what your material key subsidiaries are, I think the second is making sure that your functions have a common set of policies and practices, so that there are minimum standards around how each of the subsidiaries operate with some of the core infrastructure. So for example, financial accounting, understanding where there might be local differences for good reason around legislation, etc. But the starting point is around those sort of common practices. And I think the same for the assurance activity that you undertake, whether that's external assurance, your external auditors, and making sure a single partner owns the entire portfolio, as it were, but also your internal audit activities, and in particular being very thoughtful about how you gain assurance over remote activities, either remote geographically or remote because they're very different from the business. So a classic would be a derivatives trader within a commodities house, for example. So I think those would probably be the key things that would enable you to have that conversation with your investors. I think without that, it becomes and looks like a much more uncertain conversation. It's quite interesting. In the UK, I see I call it sort of loosely a schizophrenia amongst the regulators, but they are very thoughtful about where the regulator owns the group, because it's fundamentally a UK group with a UK listing that has international operations. Certainly the UK financial services regulatory expectation is that those groups have very active oversight over those international activities and operations. The reason I call it a slight schizophrenia is that where the entity is owned by an international house, then the regulators in the UK are quite keen that the parent, the international overseas parent, is rather more arm's length, and that there is much more, I use small letters, ring fencing around the UK subsidiaries.
I think that's, well, consistency. Yeah. And perhaps if we could just add, it's a great question. I mean, what we're seeing is that at the main board level, obviously the chair is the main interlocutor for governance, and will be speaking with shareholders on governance issues. And this is a theme that absolutely, merits those discussions. I know many chairs don't get the airtime that's needed, but I think that's one sort of place for that conversation. But also we're seeing increasingly companies hold capital markets days or for the board. And this is an opportunity to really think through the governance structures, and maybe also have some of the subsidiary board directors present as well. So there's a number of themes to actually put it onto the radar screen almost of shareholders, so that there's almost a premium for having good governance structures in place.
And the other thing I think it's possible to talk about again to investors is where you have a really major house, quite often what I've seen is a choreography around the different committees. So if you have some audit committees sitting at subsidiary level, there's a process by which, for example, the chairs of all of the audit committees get together with the chair of the group audit committee twice a year or once a year, or something like that. Same for the risk committee, so that there is a coordination and a choreography around how that broader infrastructure across the group works and comes together.
Thank you. And that sort of college of chairs is something we're seeing more and more frequently. Exactly
that. Yeah.
Alistair, you had a question.
Yeah, Sam, I was very pleased to hear your perspective on the value of subsidiaries being actively involved in strategy and the oversight of strategy. And we're finding a number of situations where companies are trying to improve the quality, if you like, overall of strategy by bringing in independents at the subsidiary level that are not sitting on the main board. And one of the challenges that we're sort of working with a number of clients is, when you do that, how do you avoid creating a kind of sort of two-tier system of independent directors? Because we have problems whereby you have the independents working at the subsidiary who are not in the loop, if you like, on some of the decisions that are being made at group, which do affect them. Have you seen good ways of trying to loop them in? Because obviously the group is not going to tell them everything that's going on, but there is a need to keep them informed so that they kind of know the context within which they're working at the subsidiary.
Yeah, and again, sorry, Gillian, go on.
No, go ahead.
Again, I think a really good question. The model that I see quite often is, so let's take a subsidiary board and it has your classic execs on it. So for example, the CFO, not always, but certainly the CEO. And then you have what I think of as two different sets of NEDs. The first are NEDs that have cascaded down from the group, if you will. And the second are the genuinely independent non-executives. And certainly in financial services, we see this increasingly because of this drive to have at least some proportion of genuinely independent non-executives in the operating subsidiary. With the NEDs that come from group, there are again two types. So there's either executives in other parts of the group who have taken on a non-executive role for the purposes of this board, or there's the cascade down from non-executive NEDs at the group level to take a role within the subsidiary board, sometimes, quite often actually, as the chair of the subsidiary board. My view is that the boards need to think, both at the group and at the subsidiary level, carefully, but with their eyes open, as it were, as to how that bridging works between the entity and the group and who owns that bridging. So if, for example, you have a NED at group who's dropped down and is now the chair of the entity, they are the most obvious bridge. And my instinct is they would want to see it as part of their responsibility to share with the subsidiary the group's thought processes, to the extent they're not confidential, market sensitive because they're in development, etc., or affecting another part of the group. But I'm forming a judgment about what is the relevance of that. So it might be a major technology investment which will eventually flow down to the subsidiary, etc. So I think in that sense, it is worth being very open in your thought process and very explicit in your thought process as to how you manage that bridge between the group and the entity, and indeed back the other way. So the entity having an input into the group's deliberations, the group's consideration, etc. That for me is the commonest way that I see that bridge happening.
Thank you. I think that's a good way of sort of framing the challenge and the flow of communication. And perhaps one piece that we haven't really touched on, because we've been looking very much from the non-executive really perspective, but are those executive who are sitting on the board. And one thing I've been really heartened to see over the past couple of years is much more almost investment and understanding in them as individuals and as board members, so that this isn't taken just as a sort of another bit of their day job, but it is sitting on a board, and they are a board member, they are a director, and so that sort of almost upskilling of executives and understanding kind of which hat they're wearing when they're making the decision, because probably that's where the biggest conflict lies between, you know, if there's something that's good for the group but bad for the subsidiary, and you're both an executive at the group and a non-exec and sitting on the board of the subsidiary, you know, you really do need to be able to think through the governance of that. So just perhaps to throw that into the as well.
I think that's exactly right. And the theology is that, you know, the interests of the entity will be aligned to the interests of the group, but it doesn't always quite work that way. And there will be conflict, you know, in a world which is a zero-sum game, there will always be conflicting views around the right application of resources. The classic conflict is group wants a dividend paid and money upstreamed, entity wants to retain the money and make an investment. I think you're right, though. I think it's a difficult and complicated role for the executives, particularly where they are executives across other parts of the business that don't necessarily sit with the entity. So you're right, it can be quite challenging and quite thought-provoking for them to deliver the sort of entity-specific dimension of their role, as well as the broader managerial responsibility across other businesses.
Absolutely, but a great development role, actually.
Absolutely, yeah.
Yes. I'm going to open up to questions. We've had some very good questions. One, which is a really interesting question from Margaret Casely-Hayford. So thank you, Margaret. And does a company secretariat at group level that supports subsidiary boards enable strategic coherence or create conflicts of interest? So almost on your bridging, sort of extending from the bridging analogy of the last question. So your thoughts, Sam, on structuring the secretariat to support subsidiary boards?
And I think, again, a really interesting question. I sort of bring to the party two slight prejudices, if you will. The first is my own personal view working with boards is that the company secretariat role has the potential to be one of the most underestimated roles there is. I think it's a crucially important role. It's the glue, really, that brings the corporate structure together, whether that be just for the single entity, so board and management, chair and oversight, etc., or whether it's multiple boards. And certainly the major groups will have a function that is more than just the sort of company secretary sitting at the group level. So I absolutely think it's a critical role. I think there is capacity for that function for a complex group to be part of the glue across the group as a whole, and in particular part of the glue around strategy. And those people where we're talking major listed groups, those people who are filling the roles within a company secretariat function will be sensitive to what is sensitive, what is confidential, what is commercially sensitive, what is sensitive in terms of markets, etc. So they will understand that dynamic. But do I think that they can have a part to play in bridging between the two? Yes, absolutely.
No, I think you're right that often too little time is thought about structuring the and the resource actually within the the company secretarial function. And I think where we see sort of getting it right is the governance and a deep understanding of governance, as well as an understanding of the business issues. And I think that the ability to combine those two in that sort of company secretariat function is really part of the answer and part of that, that effectiveness.
I think that's right. The thing I would add is when I was a regulator doing regulatory board reviews, my own personal starting point was always to start with the company secretary for exactly the reasons. And they know, and I don't mean this rudely, every organization is a soap opera. And so they know the soap opera that is the entity. They know how those meetings work, how easy it is or isn't to get them in the diary, how much notice people need, etc. So they can absolutely be the holder of the ring, if you will, in that role.
Thank you. And we have another question, well, two on the same theme. We talked about policies, group-wide policies, and I think, and we talked about resource, and probably one of the most contentious areas is people and remuneration. And can we dig a little bit deeper into, because actually a lot of the remuneration guidance today for all boards flows from what happened in financial services. So can we dig a little bit deeper into what good looks like in a financial services context, that balance between executives, rewarding executives at your own subsidiary level and the interests of the group? So Sam, perhaps you can pick that one up. And
my experience here is, of all of the possible committees that you might have at a board and a subsidiary, the REM one is the one where you most frequently see a group committee, and possibly just a group committee, because having group-wide REM policies is usually the starting point. And I think it gets very difficult, particularly if you have a group-wide approach to resourcing, to start having sort of idiosyncrasies across different subsidiaries and potentially different geographies, etc., for your group-wide approach to remuneration and your approach to remuneration more generally. So the model that you most often see is a group-wide REM committee. The key bit then, I think, is that the entity has an input in terms of, firstly, the measures by which success will be determined, and the range of measures, including beyond performance from a financial perspective. So it might be performance from a risk management perspective, performance from a cultural and collaborative perspective, etc., etc. So for the executive, if you will, and the first line, so that the business executive, if you will, having an input into what's been good and perhaps what's not been delivered in terms of that performance, so that has an input to and informs remuneration decisions that are made around those individuals. The second, which I think is also critical, which again I think you see in financial services, and you see it beginning to, or possibly more than beginning to, be a feature in non-financial services houses, is the remuneration approach to the functions, and in particular you see that around the risk function. Again, to the extent there is a risk partner, if you will, for the subsidiary, or some version of that, and subsidiary access to the broader group risk function, again, so the subsidiary should have an input into the remuneration decisions, not necessarily in terms of the amounts, but in terms of the calibration, as it were, as to whether these people have succeeded in their role. And that's, I think, particularly important, because there may be points at which the conflicts that these people, both business and second line, have had to face between subsidiary and group may be relevant. So at a group level, well, this is not a priority for an assurance activity, but at the subsidiary level, they care deeply about it. So I'm having to build it into my assurance program. So that sort of activity, I think, needs to be surfaced and recognised by both sides of the discussion, the group side of the discussion and the subsidiary side of the discussion.
And I think very often it's also having an understanding and having clarity of how things work. Some of the frustration is, it might not be perception, but there is a frustration that decisions are being made elsewhere and there's no opportunity to influence. But even understanding where one can influence and how decisions are made is a first step towards, I think, building that trust.
I agree with that. And part of that broader discussion around people resource, more than just REM, I think, is also things like the group's approach to succession planning for the executive, and who you might end up with as your CEO in your subsidiary, and the decision making in real time, as it were, when that does indeed happen, when someone gets promoted out of your business, even though you might think they've only just settled into it, and then someone else gets appointed, and how particularly where they are board appointments of executives, how the subsidiary board has a part to play in the broader group approach to resourcing those roles.
Absolutely, and I think they're, the tools that are commonplace at a group board level, of the sort of the skills matrix and a real understanding of how that works, and sort of a dynamic approach, can also be applied at subsidiary level. But yes, I think that's a very good point. We have another question, which is really looking at overseas subsidiaries, and it's either UK to international or vice versa, and the role that the subsidiary board plays when there are differences in culture between the foreign parent and its UK subsidiary. And this was partly my point about the stakeholder engagement skills, because I think phenomenal stakeholder engagement skills are often needed by chairs of subsidiary boards with overseas parents. But Sam, your views, any thoughts that you have on that cultural sort of connectivity?
And this is something we see a great deal actually for the international groups, where they have a subsidiary in the UK, which is the one I see more commonly, though I absolutely agree that it works the other way as well, where and particularly for the regulated FS houses, where the standards around subsidiary governance, as we say, look more like the standards that you expect around group governance. So I think it is absolutely critical. I think it goes back to your point, Julian, stakeholder management and managing your shareholder, and in this case, often your single shareholder, is absolutely critical and needs to be absolutely built around trust. Because there may be times when you say, well, I know that's not what the group does, that's not the group approach to subsidiary governance. And we see this, from US groups, or the full range of international groups, but that's what the regulator is requiring. But they're not overplaying that card and being quite clear about where it's acceptable to say to the regulators, well, I know that's your ideal, but that doesn't work within this group construct, because that's not how the group works. So our alternative approach is going to be this. This is how we deliver independent challenge or independent succession planning, etc. So I think recognizing that it's a two-way conversation for you with your parent, and then equally, if one of the pressures for you is managing into a regulatory stakeholder, recognizing that it can be a two-way discussion with your regulator as well. They will have certain minimum standards, they'll have views around independence, etc. But it doesn't need, it doesn't need to end up with, for example, the equivalent of a fully listed board and predominance of independence and independent chair, etc., etc. The other place where you see that is when groups are moving resource around the globe, and so they're moving, let's say, resource from a subsidiary elsewhere into a UK subsidiary, helping the executive bridge that cultural challenge as well, and understanding what the rather different role might be for them in managing their UK board, let's say, as opposed to the one that they're used to managing a board in one of the other regions in which they've been operating.
No, thank you. I think that's helpful. And I think there's probably also just a very personal element here, that this is where the ability to build relationships is important, and probably has become much more difficult over the past couple of years without that ability to visit in person. But certainly, I don't know from personal experience that it was also very helpful. I mean, I guess my personal experience is Indian and UK, and actually spending time with Indian colleagues on plant visits, on site visits, and really sort of building those relationships. So you actually have the personal channels of communication as well. But back to Sam's point, I also think particularly in a regulated industry, sort of being able to explain the regulatory context is and why UK directors are behaving in a certain way is hugely important. So Sam, I have a question which came in a little bit earlier. Any tips for INEDs who are joining a subsidiary board without previous sort of connectivity with the group, and any behaviours and challenging strategies is which is an interesting, particularly at a subsidiary board level. And any tips as to how to approach this if, as a newly appointed board member?
And I guess I think probably things we've touched on already. I think the starting point would be, as you do your due diligence, much of this will become apparent. And I think it's really worth asking how strategy takes place and occurs and is cascaded down, and what the process is for input, etc., and what the capacity is for that to evolve. So that would be part of a broader due diligence. There should in that mix be questions around how does the group subsidiary interaction take place? How do you reconcile conflicts that will inevitably occur because they can't all be managed away? How does the group manage that? How does the subsidiary manage that, etc.? In that due diligence, what's the extent of clarity around the role of the subsidiary board? What's reserved to the board and what's reserved to the parent is a key one, etc. So that would be the first. But the second, I think, really goes to your opening question, which is one that's harder to get hold of. It's one that the regulators like but struggle to get hold of, where terms of reference is very straightforward because it's written down, etc. But really those questions around what are the behaviours of both boards, parent and subsidiary, and to the extent there is a subsidiary that owns other subsidiaries, how do those behaviours work, and what are the expected behaviours of both, and what is it that, as with any INED appointment really, what is it that the board would be looking to you as an appointee to bring to this particular board in general? Certainly, of course, you'll do that as part of your discussions, but then in specific to this particular interaction. So really questions around how those behaviours and that interaction works between the two sets of stakeholders and the stakeholder management, and the role of the chair in that process. Regulators tend to get very fussed about where parents have dropped down onto those boards, that they're not overly dominant, and driving even through raised eyebrows, if not words directly, driving the behaviours of that board. That's a question that you can ask about as well. To the extent that group has an influence and that influence is directly through board members, how does that influence really play out in practice?
Thank you. And I'm keeping an eye on the time. I think we've got time for just a couple more questions. And there's a very good question here about, this is really from a financial services perspective, global organization. And have you seen evidence of companies that have been able to satisfy regulatory appetite for evidence of good governance, embeddedness of subsidiary governance from a parent level? And I have some thoughts here, but perhaps Sam, if you'd like to kick off.
I think the answer is, I think if I've understood the question, I'm not 100% sure I have, but I think the answer is yes, I have seen good examples, certainly in financial services and certainly of global organizations, of the recognition of the need for the regulator to have some assurance around some level of independent non-executives, but balancing that against this group, let's say it's an international group with a parent overseas, has its own set of obligations to its own regulators around making sure its subsidiaries do not themselves go off on a frolic of their own, and managing in that sense the ability for the parent to answer its regulators' questions around how do you oversee your subsidiary. At the subsidiary level, again, good bridging between parent and subsidiary, but also a realism around how you oversee the areas where your parent can be both a strength and a weakness. So a good example of a strength might be provision of resources you wouldn't otherwise have access to if you were just the subsidiary on your own. So higher quality audit people, broader teams, greater depth, the same for technology, etc. And areas where being quite open in your mind and you're thinking about areas where the group has the potential to present a risk for the company. So for example, a rating change or reputational damage, etc. And thinking about recognizing that's a possibility, thinking about that if it were to manifest, how you would manage it. So those sorts of behaviors, to me, describe to a regulator, and I've seen this happening, a board that is real and influential, but also has a single shareholder from which it can draw both strength and weakness. Does that go some way to answering the question?
I think absolutely, and I think maybe just really sort of building on that, because it is, you know, there's not a one size fits all, and it's not a tick box. It's almost like how you're building the muscle is how, and demonstrating that, you know, that you have, I guess, with group level, within the company's secretariat, within the board, an understanding of how governance cascades down, that you can demonstrate, you know, the connectivity that you're building between the subsidiary boards, and I think it's that sort of, whether it's a muscle or a capability, a governance capability, is what we're seeing organizations do, rather than sort of, you know, there are frameworks and there are structures, absolutely, but it's also the sort of the ability and the capability, which is an additional sort of component of that I think we've seen.
And just to bring that to life, I would say two things. The first is I have seen a regulator commissioner review where one of the, this is again in financial services, one of the things they wanted reviewed was the board's ability and inclination to challenge the executive. And I thought that was a very interesting, and it goes to your point about behaviours, a very interesting differentiation between the, you know, the possibilities of challenge. I guess the second comment I would make, what is always uppermost in a regulator's mind when it thinks about groups is that the whole is greater than the sum of the parts, because the reverse is the most dangerous possibility they can face into.
Absolutely, and I think also from, you know, shareholder perspective, and I do want to leave time for one last question. I'm going to ask, we've got a question on the SMR and the senior management regime, which I thought we might have been able to not mention SMR, but to what extent has the senior management regime focused the parent companies and executives on having to upgrade the quality of some executives on sub-boards within financial services? Maybe Sam, you kick off.
I think it's made an enormous difference. I think I've seen a great deal of thought go into this, and I think in two or three different ways. The first is the senior managers regime for organizations who have an overseas parent has made them be perhaps more thoughtful and sometimes less inclined to place people on the local boards in the UK. So they've got a group NED who does not want to be a senior manager and all that goes with being a senior manager for the UK entity. So some of them have rethought how they populate their UK local boards, as it were. So that I think is very interesting. The second is where you have a group parent and that parent has influence, that's the key word from the senior managers regime, has influence over each of the subsidiaries. Many of them are captured nonetheless through those subsidiaries, even if they're not directly on the board. So I think that's critical. I think the last is, and if we remember that for key roles on board, so this is board committee chairs, board chairs, CEO, etc., the regulator has the right to interview the candidate and has exercised that right very actively. And the number of people I talk to that find the process really quite terrifying, particularly for non-executives. I've had non-executives say to me, you know, Sam, it's many years since I've done an interview and I'm far too old to be failing interviews. So it can be quite a daunting process for them to think about and get ready for. So I think that's one element of it, and the commitment to helping people get through that process and think about what matters through that interview process. The second is, and there have been occasions when individuals put forward, the regulator has challenged that and said, either I don't think your appointment process has been sufficiently robust, you haven't benchmarked the kind of candidate you could get for this role, etc., and or the candidate has not persuaded us of their capability for this role or their independence from the group, etc., etc. And that has made boards be, I think, or groups a bit less inclined to use this as a place that is only for growing some of its people, and has driven groups to be rather more thoughtful about what are the skills and capabilities that our executives need to be able to demonstrate to properly populate those boards, albeit it's a learning process, but to populate those boards and do it well. So I think it's made an enormous difference, frankly, for the UK portfolio of boards, whether subsidiary or parent.
Thank you. And I suspect one sort of correlation of that is a much tighter focus on a more prescribed background and experience, because to comply and to sit comfortably with that level of accountability, you will have had a particular sort of experience, and whether in some ways we're potentially narrowing some of that diversity, of that cognitive diversity around the boardroom, would a separate subject perhaps, but certainly something that's slightly been driven by I think the SMR. Now I'm just seeing we've got one more question, and we've got two more questions. Well, firstly, public interest entities. Do we think it'll become mandatory for public interest entities to create non-executive boards? And then I think I'm going to ask the final question, which is just about the implications of what's happening in Ukraine and the sanctions, and just looking across the sort of subsidiary board architecture. I mean, I think with ARGA and public interest entities, I think the journey towards non-executive boards is already happening, and we're seeing many organisations that aren't required by the regulator already adopting this as a means of oversight, seeing that it gives comfort to stakeholders, and actually, if you've got really good people, it adds value to the organisation. So I think it's a direction of travel. But Sam, from your perspective,
no, I think I wouldn't say any more than that. I think that's absolutely right. I think the growing discipline of good governance, the growing profession of being a non-executive director is contributing to that. But I absolutely agree with you. I think the direction of travel is clear.
Thank you. And Sam, just maybe a final word on any observations on the turmoil in the markets caused by the tragic events in Ukraine and the sanctions that have been applied very rigorously, just across subsidiary governance, if there's a sort of read across there.
And I think that there is absolutely the opportunity for boards, whether subsidiary or parent, to think about this in a number of ways. And I think as a board member, I would certainly be asking my organisation how we're thinking about it. I think it's relevant, firstly, from have we got offices that are affected, and our people, and what's the effect on them? What are we doing to support them? Is there more that we can do to support them, etc.? And even at quite narrow levels, actually, have we got any employees who who we're paying but whose current account is in a now sanctioned Russian bank, for example? How do we manage into that space? And there are provisions for doing that through government. A number of banks have faced that in the past. So that would be one. The second is, have we got clients who are affected, and what are the implications for them? And then the third, of course, is the classic sanction screening. Have the list of sanctioned individuals and corporates is now much broader. Have we updated our own sanction screening processes for customers, counterparties, and in fact for staff, to make sure that we're not now breaching sanctions by delivering work for them, making payments to them? And that's particularly difficult if you have sort of a work in flow, as it were, if you have open contracts, etc. But I think those are all entirely sensible questions that boards really ought to be asking.
Thank you very much. And I think it's sort of, the troubles that we're seeing now really, emphasize the importance of boards that can exercise judgment and are on the front foot. So thank you very much, Sam. We'll just sort of wrap up. And Amy, I wonder if we could just click through to the final chart, where we've simply, pulled together some strands. Board effectiveness, it's absolutely no longer the sole domain of the quoted board. Equally, subsidiary governance, very sharp focus in financial services, but absolutely extends to other sectors. And I think the last question about public interest entities, this is a direction of travel that we're seeing, beyond the sort of FTSE 100 main boards, and I think that's very clear. And also that I think the regulator has become a really important stakeholder for governance. And I do hear some board members who say, well, it's not, this is about sort of setting the framework, but actually, within that stakeholder map, and I think Sam mentioned it earlier, extremely important, and this will be a sort of I think a skill that boards need to develop if they haven't developed already.
Yeah,
and
agree.
Yeah, and our final point is the clarity of remit really matters, but it's behaviours. It is those behaviours, building those bridges, which is a lovely way to end today, as Sam said. I mean, it's the behaviours that enable you to do that. So thank you very much, Sam. Thanks to Alistair and Steve as well for your questions, and thanks to all of you for joining. Amy, if we could just click to the next chart. Looking forward, our next roundtable in March is neurodiversity, and looking at the opportunities for neurodiversity in employment. So we hope that many of you will be able to join us then. And then we'll be looking at board evaluation and board composition later in April. So we'll keep you posted. I'd like to thank you all for joining today, and a big thanks to Sam as well for sharing our thoughts on subsidiary governance. Thank you all very much indeed. Thank you. Bye-bye. Bye.